The revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg said 100 years ago that society stands at a crossroads, either transition to socialism or regression to barbarism. What barbarism means today is more and more clear.
The exploitation of wilderness ecosystems for profit has created the conditions for a virus like COVID-19 to thrive. In the name of profit, hundreds of thousands have been allowed to die.
A jobs massacre is underway, and we are seeing a growth of racist forces that tries to blame migrants and refugees for the failure of capitalism. The racist immigration policies of the British state and fortress Europe continue to condemn people to die in their struggle for a better life.
Climate chaos threatens the very existence of our species on this planet. The clock is ticking, and governments across the world haven't shown any will to take the radical action needed to stop an environmental catastrophe.
Fortunately, that's not the whole picture. We've also seen inspiring resistance to these threats. The Black Lives Matter movement has shaken the racist system to its core, challenging the legacy of empire and slavery. Millions of school student strikers have led the way in showing we won't stand by while they wreck our planet.
From Bolivia to Belarus, ordinary people have reason to say enough is enough. And record support for Scottish independence also shows the thirst for real change. Marxism in Scotland, in its 2020 online edition, will be the place to discuss alternatives to barbarism and how ordinary people can fight for them.
Join hundreds of anti-capitalists from across Scotland, international socialists, campaigners and authors for a 2-day programme of events, debates, workshops and radical culture. Register yourself for the event now and we'll see you there.
Hello everyone, I'd like to give everyone such a warm welcome for joining us for this live broadcast and the final event of Socialism or Barbarism, the Marxism in Scotland online edition 2020. So first of all, I'd just like to introduce myself to everyone. My name is Tony Bruce and I'm a member of the Socialist Workers' Party in Glasgow and I will be the host for this event. So as I said before, this is the final event of the weekend. We've had so many brilliant talks, discussions and performances on so many important issues. Coronavirus and the economy, transliberation, how capitalism spreads pandemics, the US election, conspiracy theories, revolution, to name a few. So it seems only fitting that we close this incredible weekend off with one of the most important issues of our time. Capitalism versus life on Earth is the title of the event, and we are here this afternoon to hear from one of Canada's leading socialist environmentalists on this very subject. But before we kick things off, as many people might be aware, we have been running a virtual culture tent throughout the weekend. This has been a festival of ideas and art to change the world. So for every meeting and workshop, we've had some music, art, or poetry to kick things off. So starting the meeting today is a poet and musician from Brisbane, Australia, Kamala Emmanuel. Kamala is active in the climate justice campaigns in Australia, which, as we all know, was ravaged by wildfires at the start of this year. This is just one part of the world where the accelerating climate crisis is increasing the intensity of extreme weather events. Kamala has toured and recorded an album with political singer-songwriter David Rovics, and we couldn't be happier to have her perform for us today. The poem she has prepared for us is about the climate catastrophe in its global context and how we can fight it. It's called Climate Fate, so a very special welcome to Kamala for today's meeting.
G'day, I'm Kamala. I'm speaking from Jaguar country, this place of koalas, forests and gum trees. Here where I stand, it's stolen land. So when I was chatting with Lorna about how I should be introduced, I was talking about how important it is for people like me who live on colonised country or stolen country to acknowledge where we really are. And part of the way that the colonisers cover up their genocide is by giving new names to places. So the river that runs through close by here, the Meanjin River, It runs through the country of the Turrbal, the Jagera, the Yagara and the Yagarapul people. And there's no one place name for this place. So often we talk about Meanjin, but that's really the river. But anyway, it's so-called Brisbane here down under. So I want to give a big thank you to the organisers of Marxism, and particularly to Lorna McKinnon, for inviting me to participate in this session with you today. It's an honour to be part of a session with Ian Angus, and anyone who's read his book Facing the Anthropocene, or maybe Naomi Klein's book This Changes Everything, might recognise some of the details in the last vignette of the several that I'm about to present to you. I wrote this piece in 2016 when there was at a time when there was a heat wave on in South Asia, as I was hearing about some of the preparations that were being made for it to get worse. And it's called Climate Fate. I was sitting in the waiting room as you flashed across the screen. A heat wave smothered India, and you were on the scene. As you tried to cross the street, your shoe stuck to the road, so you crossed in bare scorched feet as the black tar slowly flowed. Where once were straight white lines, a crazy pattern morphed and swirled as if a giant with a paintbrush splashed out and dwarfed the world. You long for cooling rain, but the monsoon will be late. And this is how some people face their climate fate. You're a woman of Maharashtra. Farm life is what you know, with the earth so cracked and bare. Nothing green can grow as the debt piles up for the chemicals and seed, as you wonder how to fill the many mouths you have to feed. As you turn to your husband to say somehow you will cope, you see in his eyes there's no more room for hope, and then your nightmare just gets worse the day you lose your mate. And this is how some people face their climate fate. You've lived in Karachi all of your life, there with your kids, your parents, your wife. Last year the heat wave rolled in and swept 1,000 lives away, overwhelmed the morgue, corpses left out to decay. This time you swear you will be ready and not have to face that smell of those left to rot in the very place they fell, and so you dig out mass graves and pray for rain while you wait. And this is how some people face their climate fate. When Sandy struck New York, you'd left for somewhere calm, flew back when it was over, once you knew you'd meet no harm. Next superstorm to hit will not be so inconvenient, even if next time Mother Nature is less lenient for you. You've bought yourself a condo with room sealed watertight, floodgates, pumps, power, and emergency light, and so you gamble on the oil stocks knowing you'll be all right, mate. And this is how some people face their climate fate. So thanks again for having me on, and all the best with your discussions today.
Wow, that was such a brilliant way for us to start. Massive thanks to Kamala for sharing her work. If you would like to hear more from Kamala, then please check out the David Rovick's album, When I Was a Stranger. The choral arrangements were written and sung by Kamala and also Glasgow-based musician Lorna McKinnon. So thanks again to her for sharing. So we're about to hear from Ian Angus. I can't wait. He's an absolutely brilliant writer and definitely one to turn to in these uncertain and turbulent times. So I'm going to give a short introduction to what he's going to be speaking about, a short introduction to the man himself before handing it over. And after Ian's talk, I'll read out comments and questions for him to respond to. So please post these below during his talk and after. So 50 years ago, the radical environmentalist Barry Commoner wrote that the present system of production is self-destructive. The present course of human civilization is suicidal. That's even more obvious today. The greatest challenge facing our generation is to heal Earth's life support systems before it is too late. To do that, we must understand why politicians and corporations are refusing to change, even though the present system is destroying our planet. Ian Angus is a long-time activist in socialist and environmental movements in Canada and internationally. He's a member of Science for the People and the recently formed Global Eco-Socialist Network. Since 2007, he's been editor of the widely read online journal Climate and Capitalism. He's the author of many books, including Facing the Anthropocene and A Redder Shade of Green, published by Monthly Review Press, and these books are also available in our online bookshop, Bookmarks. He's currently writing a book with the working title, Metabolic Risks, Capital's Deadly Disruption of Earth's Life Support Systems. And he's joining us from all the way in his home near Ottawa in Canada. So hello, Ian.
Hello, and thank you, Tony. Thanks for that very kind introduction, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to speak at Marxism in Scotland. I am speaking from the traditional lands of the Algonquian and Mohawk peoples, which is their land and always will be. And I'm very pleased to be here with you. And I'm very pleased to have come in to be introduced before by my friend and comrade Kamala from Australia. That was really quite wonderful. As Tony said, I want to discuss why politicians and corporations are refusing to change, even though the present system is destroying our planet. The problems are known, the solutions are known. So why is nothing being done? I'm going to start with some words that the great Scottish and Irish revolutionary James Connolly wrote in 1904 when he was living in North America. This is the first verse of his poem, Be Moderate. I'm sure many of you know it. Some men, faint-hearted, ever seek our program to retouch. They will insist whene'er they speak that we demand too much. 'Tis passing strange, yet I declare such statements give me mirth. For our demands most moderate are. We only want the earth. Connolly wrote that poem long before any of us were born, but his words resonate far beyond their original context. I'd like to suggest that Connolly's words are an appropriate theme for today's mobilizations against environmental destruction. We only want the earth. We want to wrest our planet from the hands of the vandals who are destroying it. As Karl Marx put it, freedom is only possible if humanity governs the human metabolism with nature in a rational way. And that isn't possible so long as the capitalist system continues. We only want the earth. Nothing less will do. You know, today's student strikers and the Extinction Rebellion inspiring movements hope and believe that demonstrations and protests will be enough to win change. And that's an entirely reasonable desire. It would be truly wonderful if just speaking the truth would set us free. Of course, much more than that is required. But the student strikes and the extinction protests are big steps in the right direction. They're building independent, radical counterforce in the streets, and that's absolutely essential. The same can't be said, I'm afraid, for the liberal Greens, including most environmental NGOs, whose entire focus is on trying to convince our masters to solve the crisis for us. And because that's their goal, they try not to frighten anyone. They don't want us to frighten anyone with radical protests and radical demands. Connolly described their approach in just 4 lines. Be moderate, the timorous cry, who dread the tyrant's thunder. You ask too much, and people fly from you aghast in wonder. You know, that's a central doctrine of what I like to call the Church of the Free Market Fairy. It's a church that's divided into 2 denominations, the purists and the nudgers. The purists believe that the free market fairy will always deliver the best of all possible worlds, so long as the government doesn't interfere. The purists are generally opposed to any kind of action to stop climate change. If change is needed, the market will do it. Well, in the mainstream liberal environmental movement, the nudgers predominate. They believe the free market fairy isn't entirely perfect. Sometimes she needs the government to gently nudge her in the right direction. They typically insist that the best way to stop climate change, if not the only way, is to put a price on carbon, usually by imposing some form of tax on fossil fuels. In essence, they want to sell the right to pollute. Their theory says that emissions will decline if prices are nudged up. They rarely address the fact that although oil prices have risen radically in the past 50 years, All oil products are much more expensive today than they were 50 years ago. Production and emissions have risen too. Rather than switch to alternative sources of oil when it got expensive, of energy when oil got expensive, the oil industry went after unconventional oil by fracking and by mining tar sands and boosted production. Despite that, many apparently sincere green politicians believe that we can fix the world by nudging the free market fairy. It's an abiding faith in magic. It confirms once again what Marx and Engels realized long ago, that the ideas of the ruling class are the ruling ideas in every epoch. Unfortunately for such wishful thinking, what humanity now faces is not a single solvable problem, not one thing that perhaps a tax might fix, but a convergence of ecological crises that threatens the very survival of civilization. Climate change is obviously the most extreme and immediate aspect of the emergency, but we also face superstorms, rising sea levels, massive wildfires, toxic air and smog, ocean acidification and dead zones, massive extinction of species, soil that is eroding faster than it can be replaced, fresh water depletion, the destruction of the ozone layer, indestructible plastics and chemical pollution in our rivers and lakes and oceans, deforestation, expanding deserts, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and as we all know, new diseases and plagues on a scale not seen in generations. And the list does go on. This is not a minor problem. This is a planetary emergency. What we confront are not individual problems that modest reforms and policy shifts can fix, but a complex and interlocked set of disruptions of the natural processes that have made Earth habitable for thousands of years. In 2009, a team of 28 internationally renowned scientists, convened by the Stockholm Resilience Center, identified what they called 9 planetary boundaries that define what they call a safe operating space for humanity. These planetary boundaries define the environmental conditions in which all human civilizations have existed, in which all human beings have lived for at least 12,000 years. Crossing any one of those thresholds, those boundaries, they wrote, could have deleterious and even catastrophic consequences for human well-being. An update that they published in 2015 showed that 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries are in the danger zone. Something has gone terribly wrong in the relationship between human society and the Earth. Addressing symptoms alone is dangerous. A fix for one problem may make others worse. Radical remedies are obviously required, but we won't find a cure unless we identify the underlying cause, the systematic disease that is attacking our life support systems. Many environmentalists identify the underlying problem simply as growth. Indeed, there's a considerable element of truth here. Many books and articles show that the drive to extract, produce, and grow ever more stuff is filling our rivers with poison and our air with pollution. Oceans are dying, species are disappearing at unprecedented rates, water is running short, soil is eroding faster than it can be replaced, but still the growth machine pushes on. Corporate executives, economists, bureaucrats, and politicians all agree that growth is good and non-growth is bad. Ending material expansion is a unending material expansion is the deliberate policy that's promoted by ideologues of every political stripe, from social democrats to conservatives. When the G20 met in Toronto a few years ago, they unanimously agreed that their highest priorities, this is the top priority of the leaders of the 20 richest countries in the world, their top priority was, quote, to lay the foundation for strong, sustainable, and balanced growth. Their final declaration was actually only a few pages long, but the word growth appeared 29 times in those pages. Uncontrolled growth is clearly a central issue. But that raises a further question. Why does it continue? Why, in the face of massive evidence that expanded production and resource extraction is killing us, why do governments and corporations keep shoveling coal for the runaway growth train? In most environmental writing, one of two explanations is offered. All this growth is a product of human nature, or it's a mistake. The human nature argument is central to mainstream economics, which assumes that human beings always want more. So economic growth is just capitalism's way of meeting human desires. For our species, enough is never enough. That view often leads its proponents to conclude that the only way to slow or reverse the pillaging of Mother Earth is to slow or reverse population growth. More people equals more stuff, so fewer people would equal less stuff. That view is fatally undermined, however, by the fact that the countries with the highest birth rates have the lowest standard of living. The people in those countries own the least stuff, and they produce the least pollution. If the poorest 3 billion people on the planet somehow disappeared tomorrow, and this is the result of a study that was done at Yale University, if the poorest 3 billion people on the planet somehow disappeared tomorrow, there would be virtually no reduction in ongoing environmental destruction. The other common explanation for the constant promotion of growth is that we have been seduced by a false ideology. In various articles, books, papers, speeches, the drive for growth is described as a fetish, an obsession, an addiction. We're under a spell. You will often hear the term growth mania to describe the activity of our society. Such accounts generally present the drive for growth as a choice that politicians and investors make under the influence of a bizarre obsession. And there are proposals that all we really have to do is stop counting GDP as an economic measure and choose some other less obsessive measurement of economic activity. The British Marxist Fawzi Ibrahim writes, "This must be the first time in history that a necessity has been described as a fetish. You might as well describe fish having a fetish for water as capitalism having a fetish for growth. Growth is as essential to capitalism as water is to fish. As fish would die without water, so capitalism would drown without growth." That's not to say there isn't a growth ideology, there certainly is. But growth, that ideology does not cause perpetual accumulation. It justifies it. Uncontrolled growth is not the root cause of the global crisis. It is the inevitable result of the profit system, of capitalism's inherent drive to accumulate ever more capital. As individuals, the people who run the giant polluters undoubtedly want their children and grandchildren to live in a clean, environmentally sustainable world. But as major shareholders and executives and top managers, they act, in a wonderful phrase that Marx wrote, as personifications of capital. Regardless of how they behave at home or with their children or at work, they are capital in human form, and the imperatives of capital take precedence over all other needs and values. When it comes to a choice between protecting humanity's future and maximizing profit, they choose profit. As a case in point, consider the nitrogen oxide gases, nitrogen monoxide and nitrogen dioxide. These gases are produced by burning petroleum, especially burning it in diesel engines. These gases promote the formation of greenhouse gases. They produce acid rain and smog, and they cause many health problems, including chronic throat and lung diseases, and they increase the severity of asthma. In 2009, regulators in Europe and North America introduced strict limits on automobile nitrogen oxide emissions. All automakers had to submit their vehicles for testing. Well, that was a big problem for the world's second largest automobile company, Volkswagen, because most of their profit came from vehicles with diesel engines that did not meet the new standards. But, as we are often told, capitalism encourages innovation. Just in time, VW announced that its engineers had solved the problem. They had invented technology that met or exceeded the new standards. They promoted that new technology very heavily under the slogan "Clean Diesel," and it was hugely successful. Between 2009 and 2016, Volkswagen sold over 11 million clean diesel cars worldwide. Now that's pretty impressive. A giant corporation was doing well by doing good, making huge profits while protecting the environment and human health. Or so it seemed. In 2016, thanks to independent investigations by some dedicated engineers, we learned that clean diesel was a hoax. Volkswagen had not invented a new emissions technology. Volkswagen had invented software that cheated on the tests. When the software detected that a test was being conducted, it reduced the engine's power and performance. Under laboratory conditions, VW's clean diesel cars and trucks met the emissions requirements. But when they were on the road, they emitted up to 40 times more nitrogen oxide than the legal limit. Senior executives have been fired. The company paid heavy fines, but that was after the fact. 7 years of Volkswagen pollution and 7 years of big Volkswagen diesel sales illustrate two fundamental characteristics of capitalism. Short-term gains are always more important than long-term losses, and profit is always more important than protecting human health. Volkswagen's owners and executives are personifications of capital, and capital must grow no matter who gets hurt. The reason is very simple, although its implications are complex and profound. Big banks and money funds and multi-millionaires invest in corporations like Volkswagen in order to get more money back. They really don't care if Volkswagen makes cars or clothes or candy bars, so long as they get a return on their investment. Corporations, you see, are giant social machines for turning capital into more capital. That's what shareholders expect and want, and that's what managers and executives must deliver. If they don't, investment will dry up. A person who is unwilling to put the needs of capital first is not likely to become a major corporate executive. And if the screening process somehow fails, or if the CEO has an inconvenient attack of conscience, he or she will not last very long in that position. It's been called the ecological tyranny of the bottom line. When protecting humanity and the planet might reduce profits, Corporations will always put profits first. Corporate capital is only one measure of success. How much more profit was made in this quarter than in the previous quarter? How much more today than yesterday? It doesn't matter if the sales include products that spread disease, destroy forests, demolish ecosystems, and treat our water, air, and soil as sewers. It all contributes to the growth of capital, and that is what counts. Each corporation seeks to ensure that its products produce an attractive profit on invested capital. A corporation with lower costs or more attractive products can drive its competitors out of business. So there is constant pressure to expand physically, financially, and geographically. If nothing stops it, capital will try to expand infinitely. But of course, the earth is not infinite. The atmosphere and the oceans and the forest are big, but they're finite, limited resources. And capitalism in the 21st century is pressing against those limits. Capital has to grow. A zero-growth capitalist economy simply cannot exist. As Marx wrote, the historical mission of the bourgeoisie is, quote, accumulation for accumulation's sake, production for production's sake, production on a constantly increasing scale. Of course, the fact that capital needs to grow doesn't necessarily mean that it always can. On the contrary, the drive to grow periodically leads to situations in which more commodities are produced than can be sold, more capital is invested than can produce a return. The result is a crisis in which immense amounts of wealth are destroyed. Individual corporations can and do go out of business in such situations, but over the long term, the drive for profit to accumulate ever more capital always reasserts itself. That is the defining feature of the capitalist system and the root cause of the global environmental crisis. Mass opposition and public pressure can slow down or hinder the drive to expand more and faster, and we should certainly carry out that mass opposition and public pressure. But as long as the system exists, the drive to expand will always reassert itself in some form. The anti-ecological results of such a system were first analyzed in the 19th century when the productivity of English agriculture was in decline. The German scientist Justus von Liebig showed that in its natural state, soil provides the essential nutrients that allows plants to grow, and nutrients are replenished from plant and animal waste. But when the crops were produced for distance markets, as they increasingly were in 19th century England, soil fertility suffers because food waste and excrement do not return to the soil. Liebig called this a robbery system because nutrients were stolen from the soil and not returned. Karl Marx studied Liebig's work carefully. He seized upon the then brand new scientific concept of metabolism, of the idea that life is based on biological and physical cycles. And he made it central to his analysis of the relationship between humanity and nature. He viewed the shift away from using human manure as an important example of capitalist society's alienation from the natural world on which human life depends. He described the separation of humans from food production, this break in the age-old nutrient cycle, as an irreparable rift in the interdependent process of social metabolism, a metabolism prescribed by the natural laws of life itself. Marx's analysis of 19th century British agriculture provides the theoretical starting point for what's now known as metabolic rift theory, which is used by many Marxist ecologists to analyze and understand modern environmental crises. The concept of metabolic rift expresses society's simultaneous dependence on and separation from the rest of nature. Like an autoimmune disease that attacks the body it dwells in, capitalism is both part of the natural world and at war with it. It simultaneously depends upon and undermines the Earth's life support systems. Capital's ecologically destructive impacts are driven not just by the need to grow, but by the need to grow faster. The circuit from investment to profit to reinvestment requires time to complete, and the longer it takes, the less total return investors receive. Competition for investment produces constant pressure to speed up the cycle, to go from investment to production to sale ever more quickly. That's why in 1925, it took 16 weeks to raise a 2.5-pound chicken. Well, today, chickens twice that big are raised in just 6 weeks. That's down from 16 weeks. Selective breeding, hormones, and chemical feed have enabled factory farms to produce not just more meat, but more meat faster. The suffering of the animals and the quality of the food are secondary concerns if they're considered at all. Fertile land is destroyed, forests are clear-cut, and fish populations collapse, all because of what the brilliant Marxist philosopher Istvan Mészáros calls the incurably short-term horizon of the capital system. There's an insuperable conflict between nature's time and capital's time, between cyclical processes that have developed over hundreds of millions of years and capital's need for rapid production, sale, and profit. The metabolic rifts that Liebig and Marx knew of and wrote about were initially local or regional, but they have grown along with capital. Since the middle of the 20th century, capitalism has caused unprecedented changes in the entire biosphere. Earth's lands, forests, water, and air. Its endless search for profits is massively disrupting and destroying Earth's life support systems, the natural processes and cycles that make life possible. Metabolic rifts have become metabolic chasms. That's why the environmental crisis can't just be a talking point for socialists. It's a planetary emergency that we have to treat as a top priority. We need to initiate and join struggles for immediate environmental aims. We need to participate not as sideline critics, but as activists, builders, and leaders. And at the same time, we need to find the best ways to patiently explain how those struggles relate to the larger fight to save the world from capitalist ecocide. We need governments that break with the existing order, that are answerable only to working people, farmers, the poor, indigenous communities, and immigrants. In a word, to the victims of ecocidal capitalism, not to its benefits and representatives. We need governments that have two fundamental and inseparable characteristics. First, they need to be committed to grassroots democracy, to radical egalitarianism and social justice. They need to be based on on collective ownership of the means of production, and they have to work actively to eliminate exploitation, profit, and accumulation as the driving forces of our economy. And second, they will have to base their decisions and actions on the best ecological principles, giving top priority to stopping anti-environmental practices, restoring damaged ecosystems, and reestablishing agriculture and industry and ecologically sound principles. That's a profound transformation, and it will not just happen. In fact, it will not happen at all unless ecology is a central place in socialist theory, in the socialist program, and in the activity of the socialist movement. In short, in the 21st century, socialists and Greens must be eco-socialists, and humanity needs an eco-socialist revolution. As James Connolly said, our demands, most moderate, are: we only want the earth. Thank you.
Apologies, I was fantastic. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great. You were shaking your head. Sorry. I particularly liked how you started and finished with James Connolly. That was fantastic. And his poem, We Only Want the Earth. And it kind of set the tone for your talk a little bit, I felt. Your talk was so essential and riveting, but almost kind of beautiful and poetic at times. I really liked the kind of imagery of the runaway growth train and the free market theory. It was all just brilliant. So now we're going to take a couple of questions and comments, and I'm going to read them out, and Ian can respond to them in his own time. So we've got one question from Jao. Now Trump is gone, do you have any faith that Biden will bring the climate crisis to the forefront of American policies during his presidency? I'll read out another question. You can have some time to mull on that one. This is another question from Jake. I know changing capitalism will be near enough impossible. So how can we use capitalism to work with nature instead of against it? I know everything is down to supply and demand. So we need to change our choices in everyday life to start working with nature rather than against it. We need people to choose life over capitalism. If we know that animal agricultural industry is a damaging side effect of capitalism, what's stopping everyone from going plant-based? So would you like to answer one of these now?
Oh, good. I hope we have another 2 hours.
Right,
Trump versus Biden. Well, there's no question that within the U.S. working class, ruling class, there are some divisions with how they, with their attitude to climate change, and Trump and his wing of the Republican Party have generally taken the view that the climate change is not something they care to deal with, that they will go for the short-term gains no matter what. And some elements in the Democratic Party are more eager to move towards renewable fuels and so on. I think there is, I know that the Biden administration or coming administration has said that they will rejoin the environmental, the Paris Accord operation. But we should bear in mind, of course, that Biden was vice president under Obama, and who was largely responsible for the Paris Accord, which is probably the most feeble program you could put forward and still claim that you're in favor of reducing global warming. So what I think we will see is a cosmetic shift, that is more talking about climate change and probably more environmental regulation, but I don't think a major policy shift. I think it's much more superficial than we might hope for. On the question of what do we do since we can't get rid of capitalism tomorrow, and that's certainly an issue. I mean, I really wish we could get rid of capitalism tomorrow, but what we need to be doing now is building a movement. So I would say the first thing we need to think about is building that movement, because the system itself, we can force the system to change, and we have, our class over time has won all kinds of gains in terms of restrictions on working conditions and even important environmental gains. So we can gain in those areas, and we should continue to do the best we can. And the best way to do that is to build movements in the street, to demand action. And I think that's the first thing that we need to do. We can put pressure on the system, because politicians do have to get elected, and corporations do have to sell products. So they have issues of image that we can use, and we can force them to take some forms of action. Nothing decisive, I don't think. On the issue of should we all, I mean, I think the particular implication of that argument is that we do know that meat, the production of meat is very damaging to the environment, particularly in the form that it is done in advanced capitalist societies, that is mass industrial production of beef in particular. I am not convinced that arguing that the world should go vegan tomorrow is going to win us very much. There are billions of people in this earth that desperately need more protein in their diets, not less, and don't have access to those diets. And I think trying to shame people into eating differently is not a strategy that works. Having said that, I do also think that each of us should do what we can to walk lightly on the earth as much as we can. That's I don't believe that individual action will change the world, but I don't think there's a big case to be made that we should make it worse individually. So if there are things that we can do individually, we should certainly do them. But as I said, I think our big focus has to be on building movements to A, to pressure the existing system to make whatever changes we can win, and B, to build a movement that ultimately can transform the society.
Absolutely, and thank you for keeping that short and succinct. So we've got a question in through from Gordon. I'll read this out, and then I'll read out a comment from Arthur, so you've got some time to mull on the question. So the question's from Gordon. What are your thoughts on the need for a just transition for workers and communities dependent on the fossil fuel industry, for example, the North Sea oil and gas? And the comment from Arthur is, under capitalism, any enterprise depends on investment to survive. You don't become successful without borrowing money from other people to invest in your business. Those investors can freely choose between your enterprise or any other profitable investment. You are enslaved to their demand for a high return on any investment or face being starved of investment. This is why capitalism is an I don't know how to pronounce that word.
Anathema.
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 Anathema. Thank you. To the idea of sustainable development. Would you want to answer Gordon's question, maybe?
I think the concept of just transition is very important to the movement, and it's something that at least some sections of the movement have not, of the environmental movement, have not understood. There's been, here in Canada where I live, of course, the tar sands are a huge environmental issue, and there are certainly among some Greens a tendency to criticize the workers who work there as being responsible for massive pollution, not recognizing we live in a system where people have to have jobs. And in fact, in the case of the tar sands, you get tens of thousands of workers who travel from the poorest parts of Canada just in order to make a living driving a truck or whatever they do in the tar sands. And think about this very briefly. The people who work in the tar sands have more power to shut that down than anyone else directly. And they will not do that if we treat their desire to feed their families as somehow illegitimate. What we need to do is pose alternatives in terms of what other things. I mean, for example, in the case of the tar sands in Canada, just cleaning up the mess is going to produce thousands and thousands of jobs. We should look at building and making sure those jobs would go to the people who might lose on shutdowns, and retraining and moving into environmentally positive work. The whole campaign for climate jobs that you have in the UK is a very important example of that. A just transition is critical. The people who work in those industries and and when those jobs disappear must be part of the solution.
Thank you. I'll just read out a couple more questions that we've got in. This is a question from John. Do you think that a global coordination between countries is a possibility, or will governments wait until it's too late? And I'll read out the question from Barry as well. Issues of pollution, waste, packaging, etc. have engaged millions around the world in concern for the environment. At the same time, people struggle to envisage the alternative to our system. There is a commonly held view that an environmentally ethical future would either be a hair-shirt return to subsistence living, or some vision of distorted Stalinist type of society like China, where waste is continuous. How would you envisage a future non-capitalist society managing in an eco-socialist positive way?
Yeah, again, I will try to keep this under an hour. Those are really important and complex questions. Coordination between countries, yes, I think it's possible. No, I think it's very difficult to achieve in a world in which not only does each corporation fight for economic and other advantages, but the governments that they own and control fight for advantage between countries. So you do get the phenomenon of each country saying, well, here in Canada, there's this constant thing of saying, well, us doing anything, we won't do anything to deal with our environment with emissions until all the other countries do. And that's a constant problem. But again, that's part of the reason why the socialist movement has to be international, why it can't simply be restricted to fighting on specific. While we have to fight on local issues, we need an international program. I was very excited by the launch of the Global Eco-Socialist Network earlier this year, and I've been on the steering committee for some time now. But the idea that socialists, eco-socialists in different countries can coordinate, and even just on the level of exchanging ideas, is very important to this. Because again, I don't think we will see the big powers on their own doing much more than what we saw in the Paris Accord. And as I've said, the Paris Accord, it makes promises and then makes them entirely voluntary. And all of the countries that have submitted their plans for how to meet the goal, meet their objectives, none of them achieve what the Paris Accord, which is inadequate at best. None of them even achieve it. So it's going to take international pressure. That's one of the wonderful things about the student movement with Greta Thunberg, was that it was in country after country after country. We saw masses of young people in the streets, and we need much, much more of that. How can we have a society that isn't a hair shirt return to subsistence living, as Hector wrote? I think the first thing we can confront, and this has been very much raised in my book on the Anthropocene and other books, is we will deal with the fact that the capitalist system is extraordinarily wasteful. Simply, they like to talk about efficiency, but what they mean by efficiency is profitability. Think of the amount that is spent on the military. Think of the amounts that are spent on duplicated products, on unnecessary packaging, on products that nobody actually needs, but you constantly make small. Every year we get a minor change in the iPhone, and you can't upgrade it. You have to get a whole new one to get those features. The system is hugely wasteful, and estimates vary. But I would say a reasonable estimate is that just by eliminating the waste built into the system, we could free up something of the order of a third to a half of the wealth of the existing large capitalist countries to be used without any reduction in the standard of living, to be used to help develop the countries that desperately need more growth. We know that in food, there's already more food produced than humans need on a calorie basis. And it's not like people are going to have to starve. We may have to have fewer steaks, but the need to ensure that the world is well fed and that everybody has education and decent housing and so on, I think is fairly achievable by the method, as I said, of eliminating waste, eliminating unnecessary production, and cleaning up the mess that we currently live with.
Okay, a couple more questions have come in. I'll just read them out for you. So this one's from Julie. It says, workers that have the power collectively to get rid of this barbaric system and bring in the kind of society that can end the logic of putting profit before people and planet. How do you think the climate movement can help the emergence of this kind of mass action by workers? And then there's another question from Raj. What is meant by degrowth? Should socialists be for or against this?
I've been active in the socialist movement for almost my entire life. And I think you can tell I've been around a while. So if I had an instant answer for how we could get mass action by workers to change the system, I would have told you by now. And I think the things we need to do, obviously, we need, as I said, when we were talking about just transition, we need to focus on making it clear that we are not talking about forcing people to starve or forcing people to do without their jobs. We are talking about a world in which people will actually have better lives, more free time, more circumstances. So our program has to be clear. We also have to do our best to reach out and speak to the people who have that power. And that has been a weakness often of the green movement, that, as I said before, some people tend to focus on the fact that, people just want to eat more. They just want bigger cars. They just, a sort of psychological critique, which I think does not work at all. But in the long run, the thing we have going for us is the capitalist system. And that is that it tends to turn the people who have to live in it against it over time. As Marx and Engels said, it produces its own gravediggers. And that's what we have to work on, to find the places where opportunities for workers' action occur, where demands can be raised that are very clearly focused on working towards workers' control and eliminating the capitalist parties, building organizations that are alternatives. In the United States, for example, there is simply no alternative party to the big, they're just two capitalist parties. So in terms of creating a new government, the options are simply not there. Building an actual workers' party, a labor party, is an important issue in that country. And it will be different in different countries. Degrowth is an interesting term and an interesting concept. It originated in France, and there's a whole sort of rather academic current that argues what I said in my talk, and that is that this system of constant growth is destructive. Now, and they argue, let's end growth. Now, then, if you look beyond that, you'll find that different people who argue, I think that as socialists, we can't disagree that we want this system to stop producing wasteful stuff and stop overproducing things that nobody needs and so on. If you look at the actual things that degrowth people argue for, there's a big range. I mean, there are eco-socialists who basically say degrowth should be part of a socialist program, and that only a socialist program can really achieve it. There are other degrowthers who will argue simply the only issue is reduce growth, get rid of gross national product or gross domestic product, and stop making things, and rather lack of growth in the abstract. And there's a tendency, at least in some degrowth circles, to ignore the problem that we have 3 billion people in this world who do not have enough to eat, who go to bed hungry, who don't have jobs, who are living under appalling conditions, and those countries are going to need significant increases in growth, those areas, in order for a socialist society to make any sense. So there's going to be need for not degrowth as such, but a redistribution of wealth. And that is something we have to look at. So I think the degrowth people, the ones I've read, many of them have very good criticisms of the existing system. And some of them are starting to move towards socialist criticisms within degrowth. And that's very important too. That's something we should follow and try and wherever possible, socialists should ally with those people on those areas where we have issues in common.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So I'm only going to read out 2 more questions. This can be seen as our sort of final round if you want. So you can, if you want, you can have a sort of chance to just sum up anything that you want to. So we've had lots of people asking about COP. Obviously, it was postponed. It was supposed to be taking place this month, maybe, I think, or in Glasgow, but obviously it's been postponed to next year. So this is a question from Dave. COP26 comes to Glasgow next year. How can socialists maximise the potential for building involvement and action in the build-up to it? And the final question is from Sarah. We've been taught to think of climate change as a single apocalyptic event, but it will be a process. How will this process unfold? And how can we expect ruling classes to respond? Quite a biggie.
Yeah, again, a big one. Yeah, I was really disappointed that COP26 got delayed because Scotland's one of my favorite places to visit, and I certainly plan to be in Glasgow for that. But there are already committees and coalitions starting to talk about organizing for COP26, doing events in advance, planning parallel conferences. The Global Eco-Socialist Network is put forward a proposal, not as this is what we must do, but as a suggestion that we should plan for a global strike at the time of COP26. And I think that's a very positive thing that may fit into global plans. But I think we need to, as I say, organize as much as we can. I doubt if we are going to get 1 million people marching down the streets of Glasgow. Sure would be nice though. But I think that we need global protests around the time of COP26, but also in advance, because COP26 has got delegates from all over the world, and we need to make our voices heard in advance. We also need, I think, to develop very concrete programs and demands for that. In some of the past COPs, where the protests have largely been organized by NGOs, who typically seem to turn it over to advertising agencies, we get weird slogans like the one in Denmark, where the main slogan was tick, 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 which seemed to imply, okay, time's almost up, but it didn't demand anything. And I think very clearly the demand for zero emissions by 2030 is going to be a strong part of what we should organize around. That's something I will be very strongly in favor of. Apocalyptic events and processes. Yes, there's a tendency, and there's a common mistake. I mean, I've seen it in very recently in a resolution, a socialist group I put forward that I saw, who were saying, well, we've only got 10 years or else civilization's going to collapse. That is not what's going to happen. It's not what anybody has said. The 10-year number that you do hear about is if we don't cut emissions within 10 years, the island states will start to be flooded. And that's catastrophic for them, but it isn't the world collapsing. We have time. We don't have forever. And what we will see is sequential problems around climate and other things. And I think that the pandemic is an example of the kinds of things that result from environmental destruction. I'm sure Rob and Mike discussed that yesterday. We will see more and more of those. The insane levels of forest fires and jungle fires that we've seen in Australia and in Brazil recently, that will increase. Diseases will increase. And I think that we will see the ruling classes do things around the edges, and increasingly, especially in the wealthy countries, start to try and pull back into sort of fortress positions, keeping out immigrants. We're seeing that on a large scale, keeping out the people who are driven out of their homelands. But I think that they will respond doing the least they can. And even when their own best interests are at stake, the capitalist system is not one that easily reacts to massive social problems. So I think we have, in the coming years and decades, declining environmental conditions, I think, are rather inevitable, and poor responses by our governments, and ever more need to say, and I'll finish off, we only want the earth.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ian, for everything. And then there's hundreds of people watching this right now over our platforms, and I'm sure they'd all join in and wishing you saying thank you so much for that. And I hope you've enjoyed speaking.
It has been absolutely great, and I do hope I can see you next year at COP26.
Yeah, please come to Glasgow when you're able to. And actually, yeah, I'd like to just make a call for everyone watching, all the sort of socialists around the world, to join us in Glasgow next year and demand action at COP. Let's make it as big as possible. So thank you so much, Ian. Yes, just to remind people about Ian's books that are available at the Bookmarks online shop. So you can get Facing the Anthropocene, Fossil Capitalism and the Crisis of the Earth System, and A Redder Shade of Green, Intersections of Science and Socialism. These are both available at the Bookmark shop, which is down there. Yes, don't buy from Amazon, support independent bookshops. So yeah, I'd just like to say, because this is obviously the last event, the event has just gone absolutely brilliantly. We've had nearly 400 people registering to attend, hundreds of people attending. And yeah, we've got absolutely amazing feedback from all the talks, the workshops, all the culture. It's all been brilliant. And so thank you everyone for joining us. So the theme I would like to kind of hold in mind, it was socialism or barbarism. And I feel like the events over the weekend have sort of explored the two sides to this: climate chaos, the rise of the far right, pandemics. And it's also encouraged really sort of active, engaging discussion on how to resist this, how to fight this. And I feel like this has ended on a very positive and hopeful note. If you like what you've heard over this weekend and it has resonated with you, then I would really, really encourage you to join us, to join the socialists, the revolutionary socialists, and this is a revolutionary socialist party, the biggest one in the UK, the Socialist Workers' Party. So I'd really, really encourage you to join. We're involved in all different pockets of struggle, all different struggles for liberation. We see so many of the horrors and the struggles of our time kind of connected to the system of capitalism, and we fight for its demise, and we'd like you to join us with that too. So thank you so much.